The Standard Deviations podcast is a weekly production that looks at money, mind, and meaning, all through a psychological lens. Each week, psychologist and New York Times bestselling author Dr. Daniel Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest, experts in everything from finance to literature to wellness.
When was the last time you splurged on something when you knew it probably conflicted with one of your financial goals, like paying down debt or saving for future fun in retirement? Well, if you do this, you're not alone. It's because of present bias, or to use the psychobabble term, hyperbolic discounting. As humans, we have a tendency to let the immediate rewards of the here and now win out over a desired future reality. To learn more, check out the Cash Dash Dash, a planning tool brought to you by the Guardian Network to see just how much your short-term spends might be impacting your longer-term financial goals. Play today by visiting www.livingconfidently.com/play.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby. I am joined today by fellow behavioral scientist Maddie Quinlan. Maddie has a master's in behavioral science from the London School of Economics. She is the co-founder and director of Salient, which is a behavioral science consultancy. She is head of membership at the newly formed Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists. And most importantly, she's a yoga teacher. Welcome to the show, Maddie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
So you are one of the brightest young minds in behavioral science. I've been lucky enough to know you for a couple of years now, maybe a lot of years at this point. But we're actually not going to really talk about behavioral science today. The name of this podcast is going to be two behavioral scientists talking about something totally unrelated. So you recently shared with me a flow chart that you've been sort of putting together, and there's no better medium to talk about flow charts than a podcast. So the flow chart sort of began with know who you are, which led to what you do, which then forked off in sort of a bifurcation into change the world in deep meaning. So I hope I described that well to the listeners. Now, this is stuff I spend all my time thinking about, right? I mean, this is what I spend all my time thinking about. I was joking with you, not joking, before the show that I've been working on a book about the meaning of life for like 3 years, and I haven't figured out the meaning of life. So I'm excited to discuss this with you. So first off, tell us about your journey and why you're so wed to these ideas. What is it about you, your life, your journey that makes you think so deeply about these things?
I agree with you. The flow chart, it makes a lot of sense when you're looking at it more so. So maybe we can throw up a screenshot on Twitter or something like that to better represent what we're talking about. But you described it perfectly. It really has become this manifestation of connecting the dots. And I think we're similar, and a lot of people are similar in this drive to kind of want to put the pieces together. And I think the COVID period has facilitated a lot of space for people to be able to sort of use this for hindsight and start to be making some different connections in the different ways that they view themselves and view their lives. So if that were to be a silver lining over this last, 6 to 8 months, that would be part of that. But what I've been noticing in the past 2 years since starting my consultancy is these parallels between the work that we do, how we show up in our work, and who we are, and the real magic that comes out of identifying that those things very much are the same when you look for them. So when I entered the field of behavioral science in London and I was taking my master's, I was finding myself asking a lot of questions about how does this insight translate into the real world? How do we take these behavioral academic studies and how do we translate them into real solutions for real people? And that was this hole between academic insight and practice that was really the founding spark of what Salient was going to become. But when we were deciding on how to go about that, we decided really early on that the way to do that is to want to do it right. Because when you're talking about behavior and you're talking about people and the way that they're making decisions and potentially impacting those decisions, there's too much on the line to kind of throw that away without a lot of careful thought. So the idea of doing things with quality, with rigor, with transparency was so important to the foundation of what we were building. And identifying that what you risk in that is potential clients, is potential connections. Because if you will only adhere to a certain standard, whether it's for yourself as a person or as a business or as a company, then there's a lot of fear around, well, am I missing opportunities? Is this enough? Is this too much? What could be at stake? So putting those pieces together later about realizing that doing what you do stems from who you are, who you really are, who you might not even realize you are fully at the time, but that in looking back, you're able to see that how you show up truly as yourself, it is really what's going to take you to do your most meaningful work and to do the best work for others as well. So I think what prevents us from being able to do that, from really showing up, is a lot of what shows up in our work and holding us back as well. So when we have a lot of fear about who we are and have a fear about being enough and all of the stories that we tell ourselves, that's what's preventing us from really truly stepping into things. And so that's really what started to prove to me how all of this is connected, is that the fear that holds us back in our lives is the fear that can hold us back in our work and making really meaningful change.
Yeah, I think that's a connection that's not made enough, is, realizing that people at work are just people and that there's so many similarities. So let's begin with this idea. You talked about the beginning of sort of the flow chart is knowing ourselves. And what's interesting is that in some of my preparation for writing my books, I came across different conceptions of self, Western versus Eastern conceptions of self, which broadly speaking, the West tends to think of the self as enduring. Daniel is Daniel. This is my personality. I bring it with me in every context. Where Eastern approaches to personality tend to think of the self in context. So there's Maddie at church versus Maddie at the bank, and Maddie at work, and Maddie with her best friends. So how do you think about this sort of static notion of self versus the changing or contextual notion of self?
So when it comes to contextual self, one of sort of the central tenets of behavioral science, and one of the most important, I think, is this idea that context matters. This idea that the way that we behave is very, very dependent on context. And so that, to me, is a much more practical, visible way to think about the self. But the true self, I think, endures. So those core pieces of who you are, how you show up, and the truth that you bring to that, to me, that's more enduring. That's much more enduring. And there's this quote that I saw from Adam Grant. Actually, I just saw it today. And it says that self-awareness shows you what you don't know, right? And so great thinkers don't boast about how much they know. They marvel at how little they understand. And if knowledge is power, knowing what we don't know is wisdom and gives us the mental agility to rethink our assumptions. So when we're finding ourselves kind of trapped into our own biases or failing to solve problems, we can have a mindset of, oh, I know now what I don't know. And it's only with that self-awareness that we can be willing to sort of step forward and grow into whatever seems to be lacking or whatever seems to needing to be addressed. Now, insofar as, is there even a self to know? I think we could get very high level and philosophical about that. Well, what I found through the practice of meditation, or at least self-discovery and insight, is that all of the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that a person has are truly just the self as consciousness. So it's truly just what is coming up and transpiring as it is in context. But the attachment to that is very short-lived, or can be very short-lived, with this idea of being able to seek the self, to be able to look at the self. So it's about finding a version that speaks to you, the version of the self that you really resonate with, whether or not it's that sort of me as a context or me in a context versus me as an enduring person. Whatever it is that I think for each individual really resonates is the most important, because then that kind of allows you to step forward as that and to feel really authentic about that.
So existential philosophers have this idea that existence precedes essence, right? So humankind, basically what this means is that, you don't have any inherent meaning, right? So humankind makes his or her own meaning. Scissors were put here to do one thing. Scissors were put here to cut. A man or a woman is not put here to do anything necessarily. That is up to them to define. Is that kind of what you're saying here? That the self self is discovered, or self is created rather than unearthed? How do you think about that sort of unearthing a self that's always been there versus defining the self that you want to be?
I think the first step is to sort of unearth what is there and to really put a mirror up to yourself and see what's going on with you. And it's only through doing that then change and development can happen. Because this idea of self-discovery, that's not the end of the game, right? That's just the beginning. And from there, you can identify these strengths, these downfalls, these places that we're getting stuck, these fears. And it's only through doing that then we can start to take steps to be the person that, as you say, we would like to be, or the way that we would like to show up.
So it's really a combination, right? It's holding that mirror up to ourselves to discover, if you will, sort of the raw materials that we're working with, maybe our basest self or our most natural self. There's going to be parts of that we like. There's parts that we don't like. And so having enough awareness to hang on to the stuff we like and to modify the stuff we don't. Am I thinking about that right?
Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah. So figuring out those different pieces and understanding that those pieces we don't like, there might not actually be anything wrong with those pieces, or those pieces that we're afraid to show up with. That comes from this really deep place of fear and of not being enough in whatever context it is. Because, fundamentally, we have these two really dominant needs. And as humans, we have this need for connection, but we're also trying to avoid rejection. And that comes from a woman called Marissa Peer. And so many, I think, of the behavioral biases even, or the mental blocks that we have, are this sort of protective armor for ourselves in order to avoid this rejection and to continue to seek this connection. But it's not something that can be done or uncovered overnight. It's a very large process, and there's a lot of impediments to really being able to step up fully as yourself, but I think it's well worth it.
Yeah. So there's almost like things that you like about yourself, things that you dislike about yourself that are maybe legitimately not the best, and then things that are maybe in this camp of fear, right? It's things about you that may not be inherently bad, but that you're keeping from the world because of sort of a fear or a bias you have. So I want to spend a minute on these biases. I would just commend to all of the listeners to check out Strangers to Ourselves, the book Strangers to Ourselves. Read that, finally got around to that a few months back during the early part of quarantine, and just walked away, first of all, completely fascinated by all the great research in the book, and then kind of overwhelmed by just how poorly we see ourselves. So when you think about impediments to knowledge, there's just so many. We have optimism bias, right? We tend to think of ourselves as smarter and more virtuous than we actually are. We have actor-observer bias. We tend to attribute our good actions to deep personality traits and pass off our bad decisions as being situational. Meanwhile, we're doing the exact opposite to others. So we could go on, we could do a whole episode about how poorly we understand ourselves, but how do we begin the process of scraping away the layers and layers of misperception and baggage on the way to getting self-knowledge?
Yeah, I think we can all agree that this is something that does not happen overnight, and that is not a journey that has an end destination, because obviously we're all deeply evolving on an ongoing basis. But there's some comfort in the fact that I think deeply we all have a degree of that self-knowledge. And as you say, it's more a matter of uncovering it and scraping away sort of the stuff that gets in the way. So like I said, the biases that kind of manifest are this mental protection for ourselves in a lot of ways. So when you're talking about actor observer, or this idea, this fundamental attribution error, the idea that we are commendable when things are going well, but when things go sideways, it's completely out of our hands. It was all context. It was all situational. So it's this classic cognitive dissonance, or this preservation of who we believe ourselves to be, which is sometimes in such stark contrast with our actions. So that kind of bias can really work against us. And to take the steps to sort of start to uncover those pieces, to actively sit with yourself, get quiet, watch your thoughts, that kind of idea. It's really difficult to get on board in a lot of ways with that, because we can't see what that future outcome looks like when we've succeeded at it. So it's almost this hyperbolic discounting of the benefit of knowing thyself. We think, well, I am myself. How is this really going to help me? If I'm really looking in a mirror, if I'm really knowing what I am and am not, how is this really going to help me in the future? It's a really difficult thing to not just take somebody at their word and try and go for it. But essentially what you're trying to do is disconfirming your own biases. So you have to take your assumptions and your fears about not being enough, about being too much, and you just have to test it. So it's really vulnerable, and it can be really scary to start to actually show up honestly and vulnerably in a variety of situations, whether or not it's within our interpersonal relationships, asking for what we need, or in our work context and being direct about the things that we think and the things that we want to see succeed. But luckily, it can be pieced apart into these small little bits, and that's how you start to form this authenticity habit. So a couple of, I think, great self-check examples of really standing in your truth from even a work perspective is this idea of unsoftening your emails. I don't know if I have a better way to describe that, but this really watching your language when you are writing an email or writing a communication, because I think we tend to be much more hesitant to be direct. So we say things like, just checking in on this, or, oh, if it isn't too much trouble, would love to get your thoughts about this, but no rush. Instead of stepping forward and saying, I'd like to know what the status is of this. Can you please call me? Those types of caveat communication really holds us back from, I think, feeling confident in our own selves and demanding that other people show up to meet us where we need to be met as well. So really just watching the wording of your emails before sending it, take out every time you say just. That's the easiest first step for something like that. And then another example, I think, of standing in your truth is stop using busy as a response when someone asks you how you are. This is probably the only New Year's resolution I've ever stuck to in my entire life. So as a behavioral scientist, we all know that New Year's resolutions have abysmal rates of success. But this one, I think, because it's so cut and dry, you just have to stop doing it. So when someone says, how are you? You say, oh, busy. It's such a detachment from how you actually are, where you're actually feeling something. And it doesn't answer the question. And it teaches us that not only when we're answering that question, but when we're asking that question, that there's a more meaningful response than that. That busy is a throwaway term for how you are, and it disconnects from the truth of actually how you're doing. And it invites people in to tell them how you truly are. No, so these ideas of very small habits and very little things in trying to sort of push the boundaries of your transparency or vulnerability, to me, this kind of, and you can correct me, but in clinical psychology, I think this would fall somewhere in the realm of CBT, right? So you see that edge, you see that discomfort, and you take one little step past it, and you see that nothing disastrous happened. And in fact, maybe something incredible happened. Maybe it led to a deeper understanding or a deeper connection. But this platitude about, the magic happens outside of your comfort zone, it's annoyingly true. You just have to kind of prove it to yourself.
So you've spoken out against two of my most hated sort of work my two most hated work habits here. So the first, you've spoken out against the passive aggressive email culture of, as per my previous email, right? which is dripping with rage, and everyone knows that it is, right? So just, owning your truth, stand in your truth, like you said. And the second thing I think is, getting past busy, right? We're all busy, right? We're all busy. So if someone's asking how you are, have the courage to tell them. So I have sort of a follow-on question. When you learn about biases, I think people with sort of a superficial understanding of behavioral science go, look, everyone's so silly and irrational, and look how dumb we are, and look how sort of fallen humankind is. But when you learn more about biases, all of them exist for really a rational reason. Like, none of this happens by accident. All of these biases serve a protective function, right? These protect our egos. The two we talked about, the fundamental attribution error and over-optimism, both of these kind of help us get out of bed in the morning. They help us think that we're luckier and more certain about the future and more talented and better looking and, 100 other things. So it's natural that when we start to disconfirm these biases, as you've talked very nicely about, there's going to be a little pain from that. And there's going to be a natural recalcitrance. There's going to be a natural desire to not want to keep scraping. So how can we recognize, when we're making some progress? And if we start to encounter that apprehension, or these defense mechanisms start to be weakened, how can we recognize that and sort of push on through to the next level?
Confirmation bias, like any other human trait, can be used as a tool for positive, and it can also be a detriment. So we see confirmation bias as a detriment or an impediment. But actually, I think that in this kind of scenario, when you're starting to test these pockets of vulnerability, these pockets of truth, and you're seeing a response come back that is positive, you will also start to see that elsewhere. So this confirmation bias will manifest itself as, it's like when you have a new red Mazda, and then all you see on the road is little red Mazdas. You can then start to pick up more of the examples of the positive reaction from those moments of vulnerability. And they are going to feel so much more meaningful than continuing to hide. That I believe that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy from that point on.
So it's an interesting point that I think I've only begun to grasp, I think, in the last couple of years. A lot of times we learn about these behavioral tendencies, these behavioral biases, as unequivocally negative, right? But if you look at really powerful behavioral interventions like the Save More Tomorrow program, effectively what Save More Tomorrow did was it took the human tendency to be status quo prone and kind of lazy, and it locked it in for our benefit. So I think you almost have to ask, are these tendencies working for me, or are they working against me? Right? Like, is this working for me, or is it working against me? One of my favorite questions from when I was a therapist was, basically like, how's that working for you? Someone would, it's like, how is that serving you? And so as you begin this journey of self-discovery and you unearth these things, you can ask yourself, how is that serving you? And maybe a behavior that others aren't on board with may be serving you quite well, and it may serve you well for a time in a season and not in another time and season. So anything, I think, nothing is necessarily good or bad, but understanding, is it working for you? Is it serving you? So last piece on this, and then we'll move on to the next stage of our imaginary flowchart here. Research shows again and again that others are better predictors of our behavior than we are. So what role do other people play in this role in this journey of self-discovery? And what's the hallmark of someone from whom we can receive really good feedback about who we are?
I see this sort of in three ways, where in a lot of ways, people are mirrors for our own projections. Things that we see in others that on some level we don't like, don't agree with, have a lot of triggers around. That's often an indication to us about things we might not be so pleased about in our own selves or in the way that we're showing up. So it's kind of this question of, well, if you met you, would you be friends with you? So I think that's some way that you can do that very easily without having to even engage someone for feedback. Just the willingness to recognize when you're not getting on with someone and what that might mean for your own self-discovery. Another way to really check how we show up in the world, which may or may not actually be the core of who we are and may in fact lead us to identify that misalignment, is to look at the people that are in your life closely. So if it feels out of sync, maybe there are some characteristics of the individuals closest to you that are not aligning with yours. So being able to kind of step back, look at your landscape, friends, family, work colleagues, and say, the closest people to me, if we go with the kind of old adage of you're the average of your 5 closest people, would you be happy with that? Would you feel that was true to actually who you were if you were looking at those 5 individuals and the things that they value? So that's, I think, another tool. And finally, the real most important way to understand ourselves and to get feedback is to engage with someone who disagrees with us, someone that we are in conflict with and needing to move through communication with. And it has to be a person that is willing to give you a well thought out criticism that isn't based on their own ego and that they don't stand to lose from, but doesn't agree with you and will point it out. That to me is where the most learning happens. It's not by confirming all of the time. It actually is bumping up against something or someone that disagrees.
So I love that. I love that 3-part framework. And it got me thinking on point 2 about, who you surround yourself with. And as you're taking this journey to become a better person, to better understand yourself, I think it's been a personal learning for me as well, that the people who are best for you may not be the people who are most comfortable for you. So let me say, I think that has to do with point 3, right? You want to challenge, you want to be surrounding yourself with people who challenge you. But I think at certain points in our life, right, if we're not hitting on all cylinders, if we're not being all that we could be, if we're maybe living in that fear or hanging on to old patterns of being, we can surround ourselves with a crowd that's quite comfortable and quite consistent with our own low opinion of ourselves, but may not be the people who want to elevate us and take us to where we want to go. So I think it's an important distinction to say, yes, that old adage is true. You are the sum of the handful or 2 handfuls of people you spend time with. So are they comfortable for you may be less important than, again, how's that working for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because there's really no growth if you're not pushing up against something uncomfortable. And that can show up as people that are really challenging you and disagreeing with you in contexts.
All right. So now I want to move on to the world of work next along the flow chart. You suggest that once we understand ourselves, that should inform what we do professionally. So let me just say from the outset, I'm totally with you. I'm lucky to have found meaningful work. It's central to how I think about whether or not to take on a new job. But it also sort of strikes me as an enormously privileged consideration that's not available to most people, right? I mean, if you look at the journey of humankind, probably most of history, people have just been sort of subsistence level farmers or hunter gatherers. Even today, in the developed society that we live in, most people are just kind of getting by. So does this apply to everyone, or is it truly a privileged construct? Is there a way to let your personality inform your job if you're just kind of squeaking by at work?
Sure. And so the fact that people haven't been doing this, as you say, or maybe not visualizing it in quite this way over history, isn't because we can't frame it that way. It just society hasn't really structured it that way. The mentality of it is the stagnancy that needs to be shaken up, but it has so much less to do with what we do and actually how we do it. So it's more about how you're showing up to whatever it is that you're doing. This isn't necessarily, quit your job that you absolutely do need because it doesn't feel the most self-actualizing, meaningful position you could possibly have. It's really totally not about that. And in fact, it's almost the opposite. It's that the values that you have inform the way that you will show up in whatever it is that you're doing. And by being true to them, it also attracts the opportunity to grow in your work and attracts the people that have the same sort of stance or the same sort of value systems as you do, no matter what that context is. So obviously, the more connected to your work that you are, so for you and for myself, this idea of entrepreneurship or doing things that are such a gray area between what you get to spend your time doing are actually also your passions, and it's how you make your money. So that is a much clearer example of who you are becoming what you do. But it's more about when you're coming into your job or when you are showing up in whatever role you have in your life, because it doesn't always just have to be a professional setting either, having the bravery to do it with what is transparent, true, and vulnerable to you will then change the way that work manifests, will change the way that role goes forward. And in a work context and in a true kind of core belief system context, the way that companies function, the way that organizations function, and the way that teams function, if it's coming at it from this honest, diverse, open perspective, it allows for that to be recognized by others and grow to something greater, which we'll get to, I think, in sort of this changing the world and deep meaning piece. It invites people in. So I guess an example of that comes to mind for me is when we initially started our business. We hadn't even incorporated it yet, but the very first prospect we ever had, the very first potential contract that we had, was through a mutual colleague or a connection to one of the founders, and it was for an online gambling platform. And we were just in the process of deciding, who we are. What do we exist to do? What do we stand for as a business? And how do we show up as a company? So we had to sit down and think about, engaging with a particular type of company or a particular approach to a project where we are trying to get people to spend more on an online gambling platform, is this something that aligns with what we're about? What are our values? What do we exist to do when we are looking at actually inciting and changing behavior of real people? And so what we ended up doing was letting our very, very first project go. We said no. We said we can't do this work. And we may have had to live with that. We may have lost our first and one and only project that we ever had, and the whole thing could have gone sideways. But we would have felt that we did what we intrinsically felt we stood for and what we needed to do. So that feels more resonant, and is an example of taking sort of your own core values and having them show up in the way that your business goes on. And it's getting more important to be transparent and to be authentic in the work world as well, because I think people are getting wise. People are wise to the traditional tricks of corporations and of marketing and of advertising, and the information that we have and the speed at which we're obtaining it means that people are getting more conscientious, and they're getting more conscious about their consumption of media, and things come together faster in that way. But what that does is it gives behavioral science a really interesting conundrum, because how do you balance the fact that you're nudging people and you still want to have those nudges work? So how can you be transparent but also effective? Luckily, there's a lot of research that's suggesting that even the knowledge of something that's kind of going on behind the scenes, as it were, or knowing your own behavioral pitfalls and the ways that things are designed to help you overcome them, doesn't actually decrease their efficacy. So there's a lot of evidence for, I think, what is the next kind of frontier of business, which is this transparent and authentic messaging to customers, to markets, and knowing that is not going to sacrifice and indeed may enhance the actual performance of that company.
Yeah, so that's an incredible example, and I think you're making the case for something that's far more important than the question I initially asked. Mine was more of like, should your personality tie to your occupation, right? Like we all took those tests in high school that said, oh, this is your personality. And I always remember mine said I should be a traveling musician, which I always deeply
I was supposed to be a dancer, which is just like the shortest lived and lowest paying job that you can possibly have.
Yeah, I should have been a traveling musician. You should have been a dancer. Here we are slaving away in the salt mines of behavioral science instead. But no matter what you do, right? No matter what you do, you can do it in a way that's consistent with your core values and your core principles. And one of the things that I've found about my own work is I have a real bent towards creativity. And for a long time, I thought, well, I'm a creative person. Well, then then I should be an artist. Well, there's all kinds of opportunities for creativity in a variety of endeavors. So taking those sort of higher order constructs and making them work in whatever professional context you find yourself in, I think you answered the question really nicely. So now we know ourselves. We've found a job that's consistent with these higher order values. So now it's time in the flowchart to change the world. Now, this is a phrase that's become so ubiquitous that I think it's lost some of its punch. But I know that in your case, it's really central to who you are, and I know that you mean it. So when you say change the world, what does that mean to you personally, and how are you going about it?
And I completely agree about the meaning of quote unquote change the world. And even as I was drawing this out, there was this piece of me that was sort of cringing at its platitude, simplicity. There's a disconnect with the resonance of it. But that said, I think it's an extension of the meaning that you get from the work that you do and what happens when you continue to do that and continue to do it truthfully. Because what ends up happening is when you've identified, the tenets of what you build your business or your work or your role, and people start to recognize that they have the same thing. So it's more of that confirmation bias spun on its head to be positive, is you start to attract people along the same plane, and you start to see those connections being made around you, and your own vulnerability and authenticity becomes an invitation for those people to step in and join you. And so that ends up happening, that traction is happening, then things start to click. And maybe you run into this with your writing, because sometimes the things that are so profound because of their simplicity, not despite it. And so maybe then change the world. Actually, it's not, Daniel changes the world, Maddie changes the world. It's, you do what you do, you gather the team and you gather the tribe that is doing that, and the world changes, and you leave it better than you found it. So you start to bring out of others what is an actual genuine change. And not to say that there are not blips along the way, and a lot of failure, iteration, and growth. But things start to shift when you're really, truly embodying what you value in the work that you do. And so I think, for me, this happened when Gabs was created, was starting in creation, is these people who all valued this practice of behavioral science, people who all saw this gap in an organization that could be for behavioral scientists and created by behavioral scientists, and set a standard of practice and a quality and a rigor to the work that we're all so passionate about. Those people all started to find each other, and those discussions started to happen organically. And that led to the formation of this greater body that can really change the world and can really start to move the needle. So we're not just having to kind of message that we're authentic or transparent. We're kind of living it, we're proving it. And then the people get on board to make that change happen. So that, to me, that's what changed the world is. It's actually, you do what you do and the world changes.
Yeah. So it's almost like defining the world you want to live in, and then planting that flag and knowing that like-minded people will surround you and you can all pull in the same direction. I really like that. It takes it from the level of a platitude and makes it something workable and practical.
Yeah. And I mean, the challenge with that, of course, is not everybody will meet you on the bridge, right? You will step up and other people will not be able to. But that practice in and of itself will determine what the change actually looks like. And in a lot of cases will kind of filter out the people, the organizations, the constructs that would have held you back anyway.
Yeah. So keeping on this topic of changing the world. So one of the ways in which I perhaps self-delude myself or console myself into thinking that I'm changing the world is by believing that changing the world starts at home. And I'm halfway joking, because I really do think that that's incredibly important work. Being a good parent, raising children who will be productive members of society, being a good partner, being a good citizen, all these things, are micro, they're small, they're in some respects unnoticeable or undramatic. But I think, I often think, what would the world look like if everybody got to grow up in a home with parents that were that love their kids as much as my wife and I love our kids, right? It would be a very different world than the one we live in. But that said, I think that in some ways this attitude of micro first can stand in the way of us doing macro or systemic work. But then I look at sometimes people who would be more commonly referred to as world changers, and they, sometimes weren't the greatest parents or partners or co-workers. So how do we balance this sort of, change begins at home, change starts with me, reality, with the reality that there's all more we could all be doing for each other or systematically as well.
Yeah, it's tough. And it's sort of the micro version of that you talk about. I would sort of conceptualize as this organic growth inwards to outwards. And as you say, that's almost the dream, right? You have to kind of start at home. I mean, at its very basic, you have to start with self. And it's only from there that you can kind of start to make change outside of yourself. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that it has to start at home. I think that for people that are in a more macro system and capable of making the change there first, that there's nothing to say that can't have an equally positive knock-on effect inwards. So I think you can back yourself into it even so much as you can grow yourself out of it. So you can go small to big, but actually I think that the big to small is possible as well. So those world changers that you're talking about that maybe aren't great neighbors, parents, or partners right now. And I think I found myself in being that type of person where I was very externally focused and making big changes outside of myself and neglecting the relationships that I had closer to me. So there's a cost there. But by tying back all of these pieces about, what you do and the way that you show up, you can circle back and realize, oh, wow, there's a parallel here. The way that I treat the world changing that I do on a macro scale can be reflected in the relationships that I have on a micro scale. And so by staying in your lane for now and making the changes that you can make for now, I think it's like an organic investment. So it's straight up kind of behavioral finance, right? This is the lessons that we would give to investors is you need to be patient and you need to sort of watch this compounding effect of the changing of the world that you're doing right now. You can't do it all at once. You don't need to do it at all at once.
So the last stop on the flow chart that everyone has a great visual of in their heads now is meaning. Now, you've got 5 minutes, Maddie, to tell us about the meaning of life. So one hallmark of meaning, right? So people like Martin Seligman have written about meaning as one of sort of the 5 pillars of a happy, fulfilled life. And when Professor Seligman talks about meaning, he's talking about doing something outside of self and doing something bigger than ourselves. So I want to talk about, again, the tension between meaning as this sort of outward-facing, larger than self, bigger than me thing, and how this coexists with our Western ideas about self-care. Do they conflict? Can they coexist? How do you think about meaning? How do you define it? And how does it coexist with the concept of self-care?
Yeah, so there's a huge psychological payoff that sort of meets those 2 criteria that you're talking about with something that's bigger than ourselves and outside of ourselves. And that really has to do with our ego psychologically. So we like to feel good as people, and things that can serve us and give us purpose outside of ourselves kind of stroke that part of our brain, that ego part of our brain. It's part of the reason that things like altruism are very difficult to tease apart in a very pure sense, because even when we are struggling, if we can identify a larger purpose or we feel that somebody else is better off as a result, that in and of itself kind of pays back to us. So that's a real legitimate payoff that we get when we are doing something that's outside of ourselves. But at the same time, this idea of self-care really comes down to that you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to be able to know yourself and feel taken care of in yourself before you're of any use or service to anything outside of you, whether or not it's a relationship or a job or a global movement. There's nothing that you can do outside of yourself if you are really, really deeply lacking from yourself. And it isn't about being self-indulgent or being selfish, because we all recognize that even when we're taking care of ourselves, we still need to stretch. We still need to compromise. We still need to meet people in our lives where they are. But the implication and the spillover of this is you are much more useful. You are much more able to show up if you've taken care of yourself first. So, we're all just humans. We're all just trying to do, amazing things. But meaning, I think, really is constructed individually. It's discovered individually. And at the end of the day, that's where kind of peace lives. Like, peace with oneself comes from the knowledge that, go all the way back to the beginning of this flow chart. Who I am is being communicated to the world. It's becoming what I do. I'm living it. I'm breathing it. And so then at the end of the day, you can feel at peace with that. It doesn't mean that all of your anxieties are gone, because we're hurtling over things all of the time in our lives. But the one thing that you do know is that you're living truly in alignment with yourself. And that is meaning. That is meaning.
So I think a lot of good therapy is about synthesizing things that would appear on the surface to be dialectics, right? So it's really less of, a question of, shall I on the one hand serve humankind, or shall I on the other hand take care of myself? It's, it becomes, let me take care of myself en route to serving humankind. Like, let me take care of myself so I'm well positioned to take care of others. I think that's been a hallmark of many of the things that we've talked about, is that they're not as, it's not as much of a duality as it might appear on the surface, and that it becomes a virtuous cycle, right? Like, this process of knowing yourself, taking care of yourself, putting yourself in a place to do work that's consistent with who you are, all of it sort of starts the crank on a virtuous cycle that leads to other good stuff. So Maddie, I know you have somewhere to be in just a minute, but I don't want to let you get out of here without going through the free association lightning round.
Okay.
You're not off the hook yet. So I'm going to throw out a word or a phrase, and I just want you to tell me the first thing that comes to your head. Okay?
Okay.
First question. Every year you post the most incredible pictures of your family's Christmas cookies. It's an absolute extravaganza of the greatest cookies on earth. What do I need to do to make your Christmas cookie list?
You need not do anything except for show up on my doorstep, and we will welcome you in. It becomes a very large open house type of idea. We go from dawn until dusk, and anybody who comes through the door will either be put to work, working, or testing. So depending on which role you prefer.
I would like to be a tester, and it will be well worth the trip to Canada to make that happen. Okay. Next question. Your favorite behavioral phenomenon?
Oh, my favorite is a love to hate. It's cognitive dissonance. I find it absolutely fascinating, the ways that we can figure out how to lie to ourselves.
Ooh, cognitive dissonance. Good one. What is an underread behavioral science book?
It might fall outside the realm of behavioral science. It's more psych. And honestly, the first time I saw it, I thought it was kind of pop psyche, and I wasn't truly convinced, but I cannot shut up about it ever since I've read it. It's called Attached.
I have not read it. Further confirmation
it is about
that it's underread.
Yeah, it is underread. It is about the way that attachment theory, as it is traditionally kind of known in children and parents, manifests itself in adult relationships. It is an absolute game changer.
I loved learning about attachment theory in grad school. Now I will check it out. Hope the listeners will too. What is a movie that perfectly encapsulates your vision of the human condition?
No explanation, no context. Beauty and the Beast.
Oh my God, that says a lot. Okay, and then the last one, what is one thing that the listeners can start doing today that will materially improve their lives?
I have a dream scenario, and then I have a satisficing scenario. So the dream scenario is, I truly think that everybody needs a therapist, and it could just be because of the therapy that I've done and how much I value that. But if you can sit down with someone outside yourself with a totally open space to be able to bounce things off of, there's so much value in that. Short of that, Doing something like taking on a meditation practice, or even just being quiet with yourself for 10 minutes a day, maybe writing something down that occurs to you during those 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be prescriptive. It doesn't have to be massive type of undertaking. Sit with yourself. Just sit with yourself.
Okay, I love it. I can vouch for the times I've been in therapy. I have never been kinder, easier to live with, a better friend. It has brought about holistic improvements to my life, and I need to go back. So thanks for the reminder. Great. Maddie, if people want to know more about your business, they want to know more about about GABS, your organization, or you, where can they follow you and your work?
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Maddie Quinlan. My business is Salient, so it is thisissalient.com. And for all those interested in more behavioral science coming from the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, that is gaabs.org, GAABS.org.
Maddie Quinlan, you have given us so much to think about. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, and its affiliates, subsidiaries, employees, and agents, including Park Avenue Securities and the Guardian Network. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information participants consider reliable, and Dr. Crosby and Guardian are not responsible for the consequences of any decisions or actions taken because of the information provided. Guardian copyright is a registered trademark of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America. All materials are subject to United States copyright laws. Copyright 2020 Guardian. 2020-111380, expiration 10/2022.